He took his seat in business class, but the pilot demanded he move, humiliating him in front of the entire cabin. No one knew this passenger was the new owner of the airline. His next move would shock everyone. But let's start from the beginning. Mark Williams, a successful entrepreneur and the new owner of Skyjet Airlines, decided to fly with his company to personally assess its service standards. It was a typical morning flight from New York to Chicago, and Mark had booked a business class seat without mentioning his position. He opted for a modest approach: jeans, a casual shirt, and just a carry-on bag. At first glance, he looked no different from any other passenger. At check-in, Mark noticed the young male agent, likely in his mid-20s, glance at his ticket with apparent surprise before looking up at him. For a moment, the agent's face froze, then shifted to a guarded expression. "Is this your ticket?" the agent asked, forcing a strained smile. Mark remained calm, though his professional instincts flagged the interaction. "Yes, this is my ticket. Is there a problem?" Avoiding direct eye contact, the agent mumbled something about needing additional verification. "Just confirming some details," he muttered, typing on his keyboard longer than necessary. After several minutes, the agent reluctantly issued the boarding pass, adding dismissively, "Everything's fine, sir. Enjoy your flight." Mark took the ticket without comment, but inwardly reflected. If this was how they treated the airline's owner, how must they treat regular passengers? Resolving to withhold judgment for now, he proceeded to the gate. Once aboard, the situation quickly escalated. Mark took his assigned business class seat, a comfortable window spot he had selected in advance. A flight attendant, a man in his 30s, approached with a visibly irritated expression. "Welcome aboard, sir," he said with a forced smile, his gaze lingering on Mark longer than necessary. "Thank you," Mark replied evenly, not paying it much attention. The attendant checked his ticket, nodded, and walked off. Mark noticed him whisper something to a colleague, glancing back in his direction. Minutes later, the tension became palpable. The pilot, James Hill, a man of medium height with a polished uniform and a commanding demeanor, entered the cabin. Instead of conducting his usual checks, he walked directly to Mark. "Good afternoon, sir. Sorry to bother you, but there seems to be some confusion about your seat," he began. Mark looked at him with calm curiosity. "My ticket is confirmed. This seat is mine," Mark stated. The pilot nodded, briefly examining the ticket Mark handed him, though his displeasure remained evident. "There may have been an error in the system. Would you mind moving to economy class? We need this seat for another passenger." Still composed, Mark asked, "And which passenger needs my seat?" "That's not relevant, sir. I'm simply asking you to move." Mark raised his eyes, meeting the pilot's gaze. The irritation and authority in Hill's tone made it clear he expected no argument. "My seat is paid for, and I see no reason to vacate it. If there's an error, it's a problem with your system, not mine," Mark said firmly, without raising his voice. Passengers nearby began to listen. A few turned to watch the unfolding conflict. The pilot, noticing the attention, raised his voice. "Sir, I'm responsible for ensuring the comfort of all passengers. If you refuse to comply, I'll have to call security." Mark, recognizing the absurdity of the situation, calmly replied, "Call them, if you must, but I'm staying in my seat." The cabin fell silent. Passengers pulled out their phones, some discreetly recording the scene. The pilot, sensing the growing pressure, whispered something to the flight attendants before briskly exiting the cabin. Mark remained seated, his mind focused on one question: how often does this happen to others? Mark remained calm but responded firmly to the pilot. "I have a paid ticket, and I intend to stay in my seat." His voice was confident, but without aggression. This composure seemed out of place from the pilot's perspective, whose irritation was becoming increasingly apparent. Whispers could be heard around the cabin. Passengers began murmuring among themselves, some turning to watch the unfolding conflict. Mild confusion turned into genuine curiosity. What's his problem? This is business class. If he has a ticket, why argue? One passenger whispered to her neighbor. Meanwhile, the pilot tried to regain control of the situation. He stepped back, straightened his posture, and addressed Mark again. Sir, I'm just trying to ensure the comfort of all passengers. Your refusal to comply is complicating the situation. If you don't follow my request, I will have to call security. The statement sounded like a threat, thinly veiled in polite words. Mark, still unbothered, replied, Call them if you feel it's necessary. I'm staying in my rightful seat. This statement became a turning point. Several passengers began pulling out their phones, clearly intending to record the incident. Among them was a young woman with a businesslike appearance seated across the aisle. Her name was Lisa Carter, a journalist for a local newspaper known for her articles on human rights. She discreetly started recording on her phone, capturing every word. Well, this is something, she whispered to her neighbor. Let's see how they explain this later. The pilot noticed the passengers recording the situation and seemed to realize that the matter was spiraling out of control. He turned to the nearest flight attendants and gave a quiet order. Make sure they stop recording. This is private company property. The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances, hesitant to act. One of them, a woman in her 40s, cautiously approached the pilot and whispered, Sir, if we start confiscating phones, it will only make things worse. The pilot sighed but refused to back down. Turning to Mark again, he said, You need to understand that your persistence is causing inconvenience for everyone. Mark looked at him calmly and replied, My seat isn't bothering anyone. The only inconvenience here is your attempt to move me without justification. This comment elicited a quiet chuckle from one of the passengers, further increasing the tension. The pilot looked at Mark, then at the passengers recording the situation, clearly calculating his next move. At this point, it became evident that this was no longer a routine conflict. The first videos began appearing on social media. Lisa Carter captioned her post, A business class passenger is being asked to move due to a mix-up, or is it something more? The post quickly gained traction, and the first comments flooded her feed. What's going on? Why are they forcing a paying passenger to move? Is this another case of discrimination? Let's see how they try to spin this. Despite the escalating situation, Mark stayed seated. His face remained calm, but his eyes reflected a hint of disappointment. He already understood that this incident could have far-reaching implications, not just for himself, but for the company as a whole. The pilot, realizing the tension was growing, decided to leave the cabin to consult ground staff. As he left, he said, We'll revisit this matter. In his absence, the flight attendants quietly murmured among themselves, clearly worried that the incident might escalate beyond the aircraft. One of them remarked, If this hits the press, we're all in trouble. Meanwhile, the first videos were already gaining traction online, fueling public interest. The clips were accompanied by headlines like, Why is a business class passenger being denied his seat? Mark remained in his seat, though the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly tense. He understood that this flight was far from ordinary and that the crew's actions would have consequences. When the plane landed at its destination, passengers began disembarking. Mark stayed seated, carefully observing the crew's actions. Pilot James Hill, clearly confident in his authority, ignored Mark and continued speaking with the flight attendants, who appeared increasingly nervous about the situation. Once the last passengers had left, Mark stood and walked toward the cockpit. James turned to face him with a haughty expression, attempting to maintain composure. I'd like to discuss this incident with your management, Mark stated calmly but firmly. The pilot shrugged dismissively. Do whatever you feel is necessary. We followed all company policies. Are you sure? Mark asked, locking eyes with him. James avoided the question, breaking eye contact. Mark didn't press further. Instead, he exited the plane in silence, leaving the crew in palpable tension. Mark immediately headed to the Skyjet office, located near the airport. Upon arrival, he summoned the management team responsible for customer service and demanded an emergency meeting with everyone involved in the flight. His tone was calm, yet firm enough to leave no room for objections. Within an hour, the conference room was filled with the pilot, senior flight attendants, and several managers. They sat nervously, still unaware of the true reason behind the meeting. When Mark entered, his composed and confident demeanor demanded attention. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. We have a serious issue to address," he began, looking directly at the pilot. James frowned, evidently expecting the situation to be resolved in his favor. He attempted to interrupt. "If this is about the incident on board, we strictly followed company protocol." Mark raised a hand, signaling for silence. "Let's get one thing straight. I am Mark Williams, the new owner of Skyjet Airlines." Gasps filled the room. James froze in his seat, and the flight attendants exchanged shocked glances. Mark continued. "Today's incident was not merely an example of poor professionalism. It was a blatant violation of the company's standards and an act of unacceptable discrimination." The pilot tried to defend himself. "I was only trying to resolve a seating mix-up." "A mix-up?" Mark's piercing gaze focused on him. "You had no justification for attempting to move a passenger with a confirmed ticket. Your actions were not based on company policy, but on your personal biases." Mark paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He then addressed the room. "I will not tolerate this kind of behavior in my company. Every passenger deserves respect and comfort, regardless of their appearance or social status." He announced, "Effective immediately, Pilot Hill is suspended from duty. A full internal investigation will follow. Additionally, all crew members from this flight will undergo mandatory anti-discrimination and customer service training." The room fell into a tense silence. Even those who hadn't been directly involved in the incident felt the gravity of the moment. "This isn't just about the company's reputation. It's about fairness and respect, which are values we must uphold," Mark concluded. Turning to James Hill, he added, "If you cannot align with these principles, there may no longer be a place for you at Skyjet." The meeting ended as abruptly as it began. James left the room with a grim expression, fully aware that his career was on the line. The flight attendants, though subdued, seemed grateful for the firm leadership of their new owner. For Mark, the situation was more than a lesson for his team. It marked the beginning of systemic reforms that would reshape Skyjet's corporate culture for the better. After the meeting, as the pilot and crew went home, the incident was already making waves on social media. Videos recorded by passengers quickly went viral. In just a few hours, the footage garnered millions of views, accompanied by outraged comments. "Why was a confirmed passenger forced to move?" "Another case of discrimination. Shame on Skyjet." "When will companies start holding their employees accountable?" From his office, Mark monitored the situation as it unfolded online. The videos spread rapidly, dominating headlines and filling news feeds with discussions about the airline's conduct. Skyjet's phones rang incessantly while the PR department struggled to handle the flood of inquiries from journalists. Skyjet could have taken the usual route, denying the allegations, issuing a generic statement, and trying to bury the scandal. But Mark chose a different approach. The following morning, he personally addressed the media in a press conference. Standing before cameras and microphones, he began, "Good morning, my name is Mark Williams, and I am the owner of Skyjet Airlines. Today, I want to speak candidly about what occurred." Journalists braced for the typical corporate tone, but Mark's next words caught them off guard. "What happened on our flight was unacceptable. A member of our staff displayed bias toward a passenger, and that is inexcusable. We are not perfect, but we must strive to be better." His statement had the impact of a bombshell. Instead of deflecting blame, Mark openly acknowledged the issue. He continued, "This incident has been a wake-up call for our company. We owe it to our passengers and ourselves to address these shortcomings, not just to fix our mistakes, but to become a model of equality and respect in the airline industry. I promise that SkyJet will do better." Following the press conference, Mark published an open letter on the company's website detailing a comprehensive plan for reform. It outlined immediate training for all staff to ensure inclusivity and professionalism, a new hotline for passengers to report concerns without fear of retaliation, a commitment to transparency and accountability for the company's actions. The statement concluded with a heartfelt apology. "To the passenger who endured this mistreatment and to all our customers, I sincerely apologize. You deserve better, and we will ensure you receive it." The public response was overwhelmingly positive. While some remained skeptical, many applauded Mark's honesty and proactive measures. As the reforms began to take shape, SkyJet embarked on a journey to rebuild its reputation and regain the trust of its passengers.